When you turn to the internet for information on guns, you usually come across FUDs or mall ninjas that only deal in absolutes when it comes to firearms. If you ask either of them about dry firing a firearm, the multi ninjas are probably going to tell you that all centerfire guns can be dry fired, and the FUDs will tell you that you never do it. The real answer is that it depends on the firearm itself. Many guns were engineered with dry firing in mind when they made them, while others can be severely damaged by dry firing. Dry firing is simply the act of pulling the trigger on an empty chamber. But dry firing is great practice to perfect trigger control, and it's often performed to take tension off the firing pin spring and trigger springs before you actually store the firearm. Some guns even need the trigger pulled just for disassembly. In this video, we'll discuss dry firing different types of firearms and discuss when snap caps should be utilized when you pull the trigger. Rimfire guns have a firing pin that hits the edge of the case rim to ignite the priming compound. The brass in that area is very soft and cushions the impact, but if you drop the firing pin on an empty chamber of a rimfire, it can easily break the firing pin or permanently damage the breech or chamber. So the vast majority of rimfire guns should never be dry fired on an empty chamber because of the potential for damage. But there are some exceptions to this rule. Many Ruger rimfires like the 1022 and the Mark pistols do have firing pin stops included in the design, and Ruger claims that these rimfires can be dry fired. But the problem I have with this is that I've seen many Ruger Mark pistols with damaged firing pins from dry firing. Of course, you do have to pull the trigger to disassemble these Mark pistols, so dry firing on an empty chamber is necessary on these once in a while. But out of experience and caution, I always use snap caps or drywall anchors when I drop the firing pin on any rimfire gun. Most revolvers that aren't chambered in rimfire cartridges are safe to dry fire. Smith & Wesson and Ruger say it's perfectly safe to dry fire their modern centerfire revolvers. Colt specifically states not to dry fire their single action and Mark V revolvers, but they're a little bit less specific on whether or not they recommend dry firing their other models. Law enforcement officers have been dry firing their service revolvers tens of thousands of times without issues over decades. In fact, lots of dry fire practice was encouraged, and snap caps didn't even exist back in the day. But gunsmiths today recommend to always use snap caps with revolvers that feature hammer-mounted firing pins. But honestly, I always like to use snap caps when I do any dry fire practice with any revolver. This lets me practice loading and unloading in addition to trigger control and sight alignment. But unlike semi-autos, you can practice doing everything with snap caps when you use a revolver. Most hammer-fired semi-automatic handguns can be fired on an empty chamber without snap caps. Guns like the trusty old 1911 and the legendary SIG P226 are considered dry fire safe. SIGs and 1911s have probably endured more dry fire practice than any other firearm. Also anyone that was ever in the military in the past dry fired a Beretta 92 thousands of times, and the soldiers that used it before you probably dry fired it hundreds of thousands of times more. But Beretta now states not to dry fire the 92. But this is so they can worm their way out of warranty work. So although most hammer-fired semi-auto pistols have been dry fired for generations without issues, many manufacturers are now advising against it, most likely for liability and warranty related issues. You know, the manufacturers that don't outright tell you not to dry fire their guns usually state that dry firing should only be done in moderation and when using snap caps. Most long-term Glock owners out there have dry fired their pistols many thousands of times. I bought this particular Glock right here in 1999, and it's been on numerous week-long training classes where round counts were up over 1,000 rounds, and I've carried this pistol daily for nearly 25 years. And the only thing I've done to it is I did some trigger work to it. I put aftermarket sights on it, and of course, I finally, after about 20 years, shot out the original barrel that was in it and got an aftermarket barrel for it. But I've worn out 6 holsters while I carried this Glock. And 25 years later, this thing still gets dry fired on a weekly basis, and it's never failed me. My wife's SIG P320, basically an M18 clone, gets dry fired all the time. SIG says it's okay to dry fire all of their center fire pistols, but they do recommend snap caps if you're going to engage in high volume practice. If you're going to dry fire, a lot. But most striker fired pistols are designed to be dry fired. In fact, it's often a requirement in order for a manufacturer to get military and police contracts. And I personally don't worry too much about dry firing striker fired pistols. Almost every single military pattern semi-auto rifle out there is considered safe to dry fire. Once again, the ability to be safely dry fired is usually a condition for being considered for a military contract. So that's why most of these rifles are safe to dry fire. This even goes back to the M1 Garand, which was considered safe to dry fire. If you have a AR-15 or a AK pattern rifle or a HK91 pattern gun or an FAL or even one of the newer SCARs, they were all manufactured for dry fire practice as a parameter of their design. But there are some stipulations here. Many of these rifles were made with a very modular design, mainly to simplify maintenance and mission adaptability. And many of these designs allow for the user to pull the trigger while the firearm is disassembled. And basically you can see here, your AR style platforms, a lot of other platforms, when you separate the lower from the upper, you can still pull this trigger and you can drop the hammer right into the thin aluminum receiver. And this is a good way to destroy a lower receiver. So only dry fire on a fully assembled rifle. Pretty much all center fire bolt action rifles are safe to dry fire. Anytime I do a shooting session at the range, I always find my natural point of aim and do some dry firing before I load the rifle and start shooting for real. Every experienced shooter does this. In the military, it's called snapping in. And in competition shooting, dry fire practice is considered mandatory for perfecting technique and preparing for a day of shooting. Remington, Winchester, and Savage all say it's fine to dry fire their center fire bolt action rifles, but some companies like Tikka want you to use snap caps for practice. So regardless, it's generally accepted in the shooting world that dry firing a center fire bolt action rifle with an empty chamber, is perfectly fine to do, and it's even encouraged often to practice trigger control. When it comes to lever action rifles, here's where the FUDs are going to come out of the woodwork and tell you that dry firing is bad. The Winchester Model 94 is a classic American lever gun, but it was notorious for breaking firing pins when it was dry fired too much. And this fact caused FUDs to believe that all lever actions were susceptible to having the same issue, even though the Marlins actually held up pretty damn good. But I'll give you a good way to tell if dry firing is okay with a center fire lever gun. If it doesn't have a crossbolt safety, always use snap caps for practice, in my opinion. I think that's the best route to go. If it does have a crossbolt safety, it's usually safe to dry fire. These days, everyone is also on a Henry rifle kick. And if you're one of them, I suggest that you don't dry fire those Henry rifles because they have really cheap MIM internal components. And, it's likely that you might break something by dry firing it too much. But like with revolvers, I tend to use snap caps with lever guns because it lets you practice the entire process from loading to shooting, cycling ammunition. You could do it all with snap caps. So why not use them to practice with a lever gun? Break action rifles span from single shot rifles to combo guns to European drilling guns, all the way up to dangerous game double rifles. Break action guns should never be dry fired without snap caps in the chamber. Many dangerous game double rifles are actually box lock designs, and firing a box lock with empty chambers is a good way to ruin your firing pins at best and damage the breech face and, ruin an expensive gun at the worst. Never dry fire a gun like the CVA break actions or the handy rifles without snap caps in the chamber. The firing pin will not last long on one of these if you do that. So most break action rifle manufacturers don't really publish info on dry firing, so you end up finding things out the hard way. But as a general rule, I personally only use snap caps in all my break action rifles. Almost all semi-automatic and pump shotguns are safe to dry fire on an empty chamber. Most firing pins and semi-auto and pump action shotguns are actually very similar to an AR-15, and they have a large shoulder to stop the forward travel of the firing pin and the firing pin channel when you dry fire these guns on an empty chamber. But things are exactly the opposite when we talk about break action shotguns like over and under, side by sides, and single shot break open shotguns. These shotguns should never be dry fired without snap caps in the chambers. These break action shotguns have firing pins that will bottom out on the inside of the breech face if you pull the trigger on it on empty chambers. And this will easily not only damage the firing pins, but it can also crack or dent the breech face, which is very bad, almost catastrophic to the gun. So most semi-auto and pump shotguns are fine to dry fire however you want, even on an empty chamber. And almost all break action shotguns need snap caps if you're going to do function checks on them or trigger checks or anything like that. Just don't drop the firing pin on an empty chamber with a break action shotgun. So now that we've talked about dry firing, the basic firearm types, let's do a quick overview on snap caps. The two most popular types are the aluminum A-zoom type and the plastic spring-loaded Tipton types. And both of these types of snap caps are excellent in my opinion, but be mindful that they both have pros and cons. The A-zoom type has a body that will last forever, and it's got almost the exact same weight on it as a real cartridge, so it gives the firearm a natural feel, and it gives ejection and extraction a natural feel too. So I like the realistic weight of the A-zoom snap caps as well as their durability. These A-zoom snap caps are also, in my opinion, much closer to SAMI specs for cartridges. And you'll notice they even have the little shoulder on them for this 12 gauge shell for the brass. And if you have a snap cap for a bottleneck centerfire rifle cartridge with a belted case on it, the specs for that belt to headspace off of are also better with the A-zoom type. So I feel like these A-zoom aluminum snap caps really match SAMI chamber tolerances better than the Tipton type that you see out there. Now, the downside to the A-zoom snap cap is that these rubberized primers that they put in them have a lifespan, of anywhere from like 600 to 1,000 dry fires. And then after that, you're basically going to have to throw these things away and replace them. Now, the spring-loaded Tipton type snap caps have a spring-loaded primer in them that just seems to last forever. I've never seen one of these go out. But the plastic bodies on these do wear down fast and tend to leave a lot of crud and plastic shavings sometimes in the internals of your gun while you cycle these through. And sometimes the dimensions of these Tipton snap caps are off. I know the shotgun ones fit kind of loosely, and some of my other rifle cartridges, the Tipton ones fit a little bit loose, but they still work. The problem is sometimes in semi-autos, the dimensions will be off enough to where these will have problems cycling. But that's just something to be mindful of. And also another downside of the Tipton type is on the rimmed version of these, like for shotguns, like this 12 gauge snap cap right here. I've had numerous rims crack or break off on these on the rim versions. But, sometimes even snap caps aren't available at all. I mean, if you shoot cartridges like 500 Nitro Express or 416 Remington Magnum or 35 Wayland, you have to make your own snap caps because there's no commercial ones available. So in the next chapter, I'll show you how to make your own snap caps. Before I go any further, I need you to understand that a dummy round is not a snap cap. A dummy round is just a case with a bullet pressed into it, and it has nothing in the primer pocket to stop the firing pin. So for the purposes of this video, we're going to be making a snap cap. So the firing pin needs to have something to contact when we pull the trigger to save firing pins and internal components from damage. So in this particular case right here, I'm going to make a snap cap in 416 Remington Magnum because you're not going to buy a commercial snap cap in this cartridge. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to load this bullet in it, and I'm going to load it to this cantilever right here, and I'm going to put the crimp right in that. The first thing you need to do when you make a snap cap is to seat the bullet to SAAMI specifications. And now that you seated the bullet to the cantilever in the bullet, or if you're shooting something like a Barnes into one of the driving bands, but once you do that, it's time to put kind of a heavy crimp into that groove right there. And I always use a Lee factory crimp die to do this. As you can see, that's a good heavy crimp right inside that cantilever. And as you can see right here, this is the 416 Remington Magnum case that I seated and crimped the bullet in. And now it's time to fill up this primer pocket so the firing pin can strike it and not do any damage. And for that, I'm going to use hot glue. A lot of people think hot glue is too soft for an application like this, but it's really not. It's actually the best thing you can use. So what I personally do is I get a tray like this little metal tray, and I spray it down with Hornady One Shot. It's kind of like using Pam on a cookie pan. And I'm going to fill the primer pocket up with hot glue. And if you haven't used these hot glue guns, these industrial strength ones that use the Milwaukee M18 batteries, you really should. I think this thing was only $30 on Amazon. And if you already use, Milwaukee M18 stuff like I do, then getting a hot glue gun like this is a no-brainer. But anyways, I just, looks like that Hornady One Shot's kind of cured in there. So I'm just going to fill up this primer pocket really good. And then I'm just going to go on the cookie sheet, give it a little smash down, then lift it up, and then I'm going to let it dry like that. Let it sit for a minute or two and dry like that. Then all you basically do is you just peel around the edges like this. Peel around all the brass on the edges like that. And you'll just have the lump in the middle. And then I get a knife and I chop off that little piece of glue. I just go around it. And then if you want to clean it up a little bit, you can always hit it with a lighter and just kind of smash it down a little bit with your finger. And it'll go totally flat on the primer pocket like that. And the beauty of using this hot glue, this industrial strength hot glue, is that if you use this a lot and, it starts getting dimpled or, maybe a chunk goes out of it or something like that, you don't have to throw these snap caps away. All you do is just get your lighter, hit it with some heat real quick, and it'll all melt back down into there, and you'll have a nice flat surface again to strike your firing pins on. So, and lastly, you want to make this thing look like a snap cap, because right now, other than the hot glue in the primer pocket, it looks like a live round, and we don't want it to look like that. So you can use any cold blue that you use to touch up gun parts and coat this entire round with it. So this is pretty much what it looks like when you blue your snap cap. And it's not pretty, and it's a little bit time consuming. And, you have to have the cold blue, which has a short shelf life. So it's kind of a pain in the ass, to be honest with you. When I usually make snap caps, I just use a Sharpie to coat them in black. And sometimes, depending on, I guess, the brass you use and the condition of your cold blue, sometimes the Sharpie actually holds up longer. So this is also a good method. And, this is one of my 35 Wayland snap caps I made. You can see the hot glue primer in there. So that's how you make snap caps when you can't buy commercial snap caps for a particular cartridge. like I stated in the introduction to this video, the FUDs will tell you to never dry fire any gun without snap caps, or you'll be doing damage to your gun. The mall ninjas will tell you that all center fire guns can be dry fired no matter what. And if it breaks from dry firing, it wasn't worth owning in the first place. And they're obviously both wrong, and we know that. The FUDs do have a point, though, because prolonged dry firing will cause wear on things like firing pins, springs, stops, transfer bars, frame bushings, retaining plates, and retaining pins. On some guns, though, this wear might take 100 years to matter. The mall ninjas also have a point in that hard-use centerfire firearms made for military use shouldn't be affected by dry firing with the firearm fully assembled. Also, snapping in or doing dry fire practice with a centerfire bolt-action rifle is 100% worth doing, in my opinion. I do it all the time. When it comes to dry firing on an empty chamber, some guns can handle it fine, and some can't. You have to know your individual gun. So what are my personal generalized rules when it comes to dry firing? Well, on my revolvers, lever guns, and all my break action shotguns and rifles, I always use snap caps. On everything else, I usually don't. Unless I'm checking the function of the gun. If I'm doing that, I always use snap caps for function checks. You don't want to use live ammunition for that. Through years of experience, my personal kind of anecdotal evidence tells me that revolvers, lever guns, and break action firearms are the most susceptible to damage from dry firing. So I don't take a risk with those firearms. I always use snap caps. Firearms can be very expensive, especially in this current economy. But snap caps are super cheap. So when in doubt, why not use them? You should own snap caps anyway, so you could safely do function checks after cleaning or maintaining your gun. Hopefully, you're not using live ammo to function check your gun. Well, I hope you enjoyed my commentary on dry firing. Thank you for watching, and as always, good hunting.